In the Namatequap, I say ha madoika nanania sa Dustin Tahmahkera Tahmahkera. Hey, it's spelled right. Tahmahkera, a old Comanche name, means drives them out, to drive them out. Good to be here today. Good to see all you here. A lot of familiar faces, some new faces as well. Very honored to be alongside my colleagues here, Dr. Laura Harjo, for this panel. Dr. Laura Harjo, Chair of Native American Studies here at University of Oklahoma. Also my colleague, Dr. Kim Wieser, Professor of English here in the English department at OU. I'm over in Native American Studies and work with both of these colleagues, various assignments and committees and the work that we do here at OU. Also very honored to have with us here in second row, just a spotlight, Cherie Dimaline joining us. And I think the plan is we're gonna visit for a little bit and then invite Cherie to come up, share a few words, and then see if we have some time for some good further dialogue, conversation, Q&A afterward, okay? Would y'all also like to just briefly introduce yourselves in your own respective ways?
Sure. I guess that means I'm first. I don't even know that we need these mics. My students can tell you I talk a lot and I'm loud. My name's Kimberly Wieser. I'm over in the English department, yes, but when I came to OU, I came to NAS, and I came to NAS from the NAS department at the University of Lethbridge, where I was for 4 years. In order to break out of the community college gig, because that's a whole deal in itself for professors. My areas are Native Lit and Native Rhetoric. Yesterday, I turned in a book to OU Press. That's number 4.
Congrats.
It was counter stories from the res, but they got a little picky about the fact that not all of Oklahoma is the res, and not everybody we had in there is the res. So we've changed that title up some. And before that, Encyclopedia of Native American Literature. An Encyclopedia for Students are my 2 most recent publications.
Hey everybody, I'm Laura Harjo. I come here from Muskogee Nation, and before I was here, I was at the University of New Mexico for 8 years teaching in basically indigenous community planning. So I guess everything that I think of, I always sort of center community, and that's kind of like my analytic, and whatever that takes. And also thinking about spatialities and how our stories live in these different, what I call in my scholarship, emergence geographies. So that's been my focus. I'm the chair. It's supposed to be 60% time. It's actually about 110, but I'm currently working on a book manuscript. Kind of the holder title is Ontology, like anti-ontology, cartographies of care. So when I get time, I guess I'll get back on that. And I'm also teaching a course on indigenous futurity and kinship, and we're teaching 6 of Cherie's books, and the students are here today as well.
So on that note of care, and in thinking about storytelling in relation to care, to kinship, in Native American Studies and Native focus sections of the English department and elsewhere on campus, there's a lot of emphasis on relational accountability, and to where the intellect, the mind is a part of it, and being by nature here at a university, in this case at OU, it's also very much unapologetically so having a lot of space for the heart. For spirit, for mind, body, spirit, and thinking about all of these in relation to and as understood through story. As I was sharing with students, earlier this morning in our Indigenous Research Methods class, I come from a working premise that everything is a story. Everything. There is no way around it. Your most boring grocery list, laundry list, whatever it may be, it still has a story. Likely it has a multiplicity of stories to share. And I wanted to basically begin with this idea of how our own medicine when it comes to story. You know, there's, Cherie says in her anthology of monsters lecture series and audio and book form, she reminds us of an elder who once told her to write the story of your community, to not put it down as just statistics or court cases, but, quote, talk about my story, talk about your story of the stories that came before. I think some of the most humbling, best work we can do in the academy and elsewhere are these interrelated projects of honoring and of healing, of honoring those individuals, those more than human kin, the waters, the places that have come before us, and that many of which are still with us. It's honoring our ancestors, it's honoring, you know, current relatives, as well as the future, you know, yet to be relatives. And with that comes also this very critical, important work of self-care, of internal care, of external care. Reminded here of what Cherie once said about her mentor, Lee Miracle, saying that she had, quote, no time for anxiety, and that she called for, quote, full banquet living. Full banquet living, not to be this compartmentalized thing of either or someone telling you you're lesser than or more than, but this full banquet living of, quote, feeling the feelings of what we bring to the cultural table, of dancing, as Miracle said, over all the sharp rocks of life's journey. We're in mid-semester. There's plenty of jagged rocks happening right now, I'm sure, with how overwhelmed a lot of folks, including the space, may feel right now, with all the responsibilities, all the things that one has to do, that we're obligated to do. And I think storytelling is right along those lines. So I was just wondering if we can hear some thoughts on, you know, working from this premise that we all have medicine. In Comanche and Namatequap, we call it puha, one's strengths, one's medicine, one's talents, what one contributes and what one is thinking through and feeling their way through. And storytelling is, as my late auntie says, we're obligated to do that. There is no necessarily choice in this. We have to do this. We have to do this work. And it's one thing to learn a story, but then what are you going to do with it, right? And so it's thinking about the impact of Cherie's stories and what she has shared with us and reminding us of how important it is to tell our story. But any thoughts that you two may have on, you know, why we're obligated to tell our story and the importance of these stories that we've been reading and working together in, you know, and talking about and feeling our way through by Cherie.
Yeah. Well, I can start. So Cherie went to dinner with our class last night, and, you know, there was a lot of storytelling, and afterwards there were some things that dawned on me, and I guess this idea of story and how story actually tends to us. It carries our relatives forward with us. This thing that their lives are not bookended by birth and death, but stories carry them right along with us and into the future as well. So what I had talked to Cherie about afterwards was about when my dad had passed away, and I didn't share this part, but it was like I wasn't feeling grief just yet. I was feeling like this desperate grasp that I needed to remember every story that he had told me, because like that was my connection to my ancestors. And so I would sit outside at night, and I watched Orion's belt move from the eastern sky till the spring, where I couldn't see it anymore because it had moved sort of like to the west. But I could feel kind of, again, with this emergence geography aspect of Muskogee epistemologies, I could feel the metaphysical, and I could feel these kind of celestial stories too that sit with our stars. So like just thinking about that and feeling something in the metaphysical, that these stories were being prompted to me And I felt like actually through my ancestors that I needed to capture that. And so when I did my writing, I was just trying to be honest and like be an honest witness. That's what I really love about these books that we've been reading. And I feel like our students also appreciate that too, that there's this honest witnessing. So I didn't realize that people would resonate with it. And so I feel the same way too with Cherie's stories, is like they resonate so hard with all of us, getting us through like pretty rough moments right now, and seeing how the different characters, the matriarchs, the youth, how they're moving through and sometimes dystopian worlds, but they're making it through with these stories that take care of them. So like I feel like if people feel called to tell stories or tell their story, that they should. The other thing too is when our relatives keep telling us the same story over and over, and sometimes we might get bored, but it's like they're retelling that story for a reason, and it's kind of like your job is to hang on to that story, and maybe you don't have the answer yet, but someday it will surface for you. And so just capturing those stories as well. So I'll leave it there. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
And of course, I dropped my notes right before I get ready to talk. When Dustin asked me what I wanted to talk about mostly today, I said story. And story really is sort of the center of everything I do. I teach Native rhetorics and I teach Native literature, and some people may see those things as separate, but for me, the center that holds all of that together is story. And story really indeed has been quite important in my life. I started reading when I was like 3 years old, so I've been reading for 54 years. I love books. I was raised by my grandparents, so I spent the majority of my time reading books or enacting things with my dolls, and creating other stories. But these days, I have really bad ADHD and anxiety, and I don't treat those medically. It's very hard for me sometimes to focus when someone's talking. So things like crochet help me to listen to somebody if they're giving a speech. But if you're telling a story, I can listen forever. I used to think I hated to exercise until I discovered Audible books, and it turns out I will walk till I die as long as someone is telling me a story. I don't have to quit. I can just keep going. So I've been in love with Cherie's books for quite a while here. I teach Amerithieves fairly regularly. I taught it in Native Children's and Young Adult. I teach it in fiction. I teach it in Indigenous Futurisms. And it's a really important story to me, but I've been teaching it this semester in my fiction class. And we've been talking about all the things that story does. Story carries knowledge. That's why our ancestors want us to remember those stories. And just as an aside, it takes the average adult 7 repetitions to remember anything. So the more times we hear those stories, the better off we are. And another thing that story does besides carrying knowledge, besides entertaining us, besides, in fact, healing us, right? That function, to me, is related to the fact that stories bind us together. Students get so close to the characters in the Marrow Thieves because we know all of their background stories. Those coming to stories allow us to form relationships with them. I told my students in class this semester, if you start dating someone and you're not telling each other stories about your previous lives, you should be seriously concerned about this person and probably should not go out with them, right? How else do you get to know each other except through the vehicle of story? And we find that, story, just article came out yesterday in Neuroscience News when my friend sent it to me this morning. I thought, how perfect. Turns out story is tied to how we shape our memory. And different kinds of stories shape our memories in different ways and activate different parts of our brains. So stories that have heavy emotional content to them actually teach us emotions and give us schemata, structures in our brains for storing and processing those. Stories with detailed information like that going to the grocery store thing, Dustin, that's so fascinating. That's in this article. Turns out we each have in our brain a core story about going to the grocery store. And every time we remember going to the grocery store, we just add in the new details to that core story of going to the grocery store, right? But the stories in this book, and in the stories in Cherie's other books as well, kind of push us to think about stories as a means of survival. And for Native people, while this book is fictional, I always remind my students, the apocalypse in this novel is an apocalypse that's been going on for 500 years for Indigenous people in these lands, since 1492. When I lived in Lethe, I worked with Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who really, it was like doing a postdoc, right? Respect, reciprocity, relationship renewal. But I was working on a project up there on homelessness. There were not homeless Indians in 1491, y'all. There just weren't. We didn't have these issues that we have in our communities now. We have gained these things. So, you've got individuals dealing with individual trauma. You've got people dealing with intergenerational trauma, which we know scientifically carries on in our gene pools for 7 generations. Koreans have long had a word for this, Han, right? That intergenerational trauma that we can carry with us. So there's a lot to heal from, and things are out of balance. I always teach my students that tradition is continuity plus change and balance. When you've got too much rapid change forced on the community, it's not something you have embraced, you have planned, you have welcomed, you have figured out how to deal with, you can end up losing yourself. So story and knowing those stories of who our folks are and who we are binds us to those ancestors, binds us to each other, and binds us to a future. And we need to be bound to that future as well. One of the scariest things I saw when I was living in Alberta, graffiti, right? And graffiti is marking who you are. So came around a curve one day in Lethe, 3 garage doors, Blackfoot, painted in big black spray paint across one door, and then somebody got cute, got some white spray paint, spray painted Whitefoot, really big on the next garage door, and then on the next garage door, someone got cuter yet and got a can of pink spray paint, and they painted Pinkfoot on that last one, right? Come around the corner, and I see the scariest graffiti I've ever seen, because that one was about identity. This one said, no future. That's terrifying. That's terrifying. And I think these stories are really good for us, Cherie's stories, because they concentrate on how we survive when the systems around us are aimed at eliminating us after or if we are no longer useful for capitalism. There's nothing left to be extracted from us. When we're at that point, story is all you have to recenter you and tell you who you are, because the capitalist world will tell you you are nothing. It will measure you by money. It will measure you by what can be extracted and taken from you. But that's not who you are. Who you are the stories you carry inside of you. And that's what Cherie's characters show us. And I appreciate that a lot about her work.
And Kim, you had mentioned earlier about the core, talking about the core to so many of these stories and the everyday stories, the stories that we tell ourselves, that we hear from others. Thinking also, especially in so much of Cherie's work, the stories of motion, of direction, of moving through generations, moving through these territories and places, through these various peoples. I think a related follow-up question for y'all is, thoughts on how you see Cherie's own story work, the work that she's doing with these stories, like Joanne Archibald and others have long talked about when talking about Indigenous story work, of how the stories are carrying their own motions, of how they are constantly in movement, thinking about the movement, the migrations of the Indigenous folks who are placed and displaced and replaced in her work. For example, you have Victor, who gets displaced or replaced as Reverend Wolf in Empire of Wild, and the ways in which the more than human kin of the Rougarou, shows up. You have literally Indigenous bone marrow being harvested by the recruiters in The Marrow Thieves, a book that's been mentioned a few times already today. But all the while, you have Indigenous folks who are on the run on their own homelands, or they are in search of something. This is a common core thing to humanity that we are all seeking. We are all in search something, of someone so often, and especially thinking about what Cherie writes in this book and the lecture series and anthology of monsters, I think there's constantly this search for ourselves. And she even says at one point, why are we so mean to ourselves, right? Anxiety, the relationship between story and, like as she says in the subtitle here, how story saves us from our anxiety. Anxiety is part of what can help us to be empathetic and to be understanding toward others. But anxiety is also what we can do to ourselves in such evil ways, in such mean ways of being so mean to ourselves and wondering where the empathy and the compassion is for ourselves when it comes to our own inner anxiety. And that's what a lot of these characters are working through. That's what I think writers and readers are working through when really feeling these connections, as Dr. Harjo had mentioned earlier, these connections that readers, that students and others are having with these stories, and remembering that a story is never just a story. So thinking about just the ideas of survival, of community building, of forming kin, any thoughts on, movement, migrations, any thoughts on just how the ways in which you see that playing out in Cherie's work and the significance of all that community?
Yeah, I think about displacement and forced migration. So, I'll just be upfront that I'm going to speak from my positionality as a Muskogee person, and that's how I read her work. And I can also see how my students bring their full selves in and read her work. So when I think about migration and movement, and I see kind of scenes in Toronto and in Vinco where Lucky is moving across borders and space. I see folks moving across space and time. I guess to come to this, I want to lay out this idea of Indigenous futurity or Muskogee futurity as well, which is this idea that it's in part past, present, and future, but the past is the idea that our ancestors' unactivated possibilities, that we're working on them today. But we're also working on the kind of future that we also need right now. We're also working on the futures for our future relatives as well. So it's sort of like all that's happening simultaneously. And so reading her work, I can see that happening. And another thing that I'm also always desperately looking for, kind of like a play on Joy Harjo's work, is the map to the next world. So what does that map to the next world look like? It looks like maybe our ancestors' unactivated possibilities. You see those getting played out across Dimaline's stories. You see the matriarchs show up in different moments, in different forms, whether they're straight up in the community, like rural community reserve, or they're in the city. They're showing up and showing the way. So I feel like it helps to remind us who the actors are in the community that we need to look around and pay attention to, whether it's like our crazy auntie that's talking nonsense most of the time, but she shows up with some pretty good wisdom, like when we need it, or young people. Yeah, and I connect that kind of to Leanne Simpson's work of like respecting the knowledge that young people bring to you and that their knowledge is just as valid as well. So when I think of being in movement or our communities in movement, I can see these stories that are moving across place and time, and it's just really instructive of again, how to look around our community and see the things that we need. But again, like these journeys of like, I think what really drew me into Marrow Thieves is them moving through the woods and like they're made kin. And I know a lot of my relatives don't feel safe being in Oklahoma. And I think of my relatives that are queer young people, and they feel like they have to move through these violent spaces here. So, I'm sorry. So when I think of Marrow Thieves and I see made kin and them embracing each other, and I think of like my relatives and how they have to pass through these spaces, whether they're here and there's active violence, or they're in a city maybe where they feel comfortable, or they can find, their family, but they still have to move through like these wilderness, right? So that's wilderness to them if they don't already know those spaces. So to me, it's like really instructive of like that movement through space, movement through maybe the unknown and Frenchie and what he was facing, but he had made kin embracing him and telling him stories and teaching him language and that sort of thing. So I think of that aspect of like care and movement and story and how we're always all in movement and like how does that carry us through. There's just a lot of movement. And so when I think also of like removal, like when we bury our loved ones, we have things that we still do today. And one of those is they usually put their favorite blanket, or if they don't have a favorite blanket, they'll get a nice blanket and put it on their casket. And that's supposed to go back to the Trail of Tears when there wasn't enough time to bury people, so they would cover them with rocks and then put their blanket on them. So when I think of like those stories, that's a form of like our community or our nation instantiating place, even if momentarily or this ephemeral space, they're instantiating like their community in that moment. And like I see how that has carried across space and time as well. Like there are songs, there's one in particular that they sing on Reservation Dogs, and it's called This Might Be the Last Time. And that is supposed to be a song that was sung on the Trail of Tears. So us still singing those songs and us still putting those blankets on our loved ones when they transition to the spirit world, to me, those are still like forms of story being in movement and instantiating like multiple futurities. So I also see this in the books. Like, I mean, I go on and on, but I think of like Vinco and the Spoons, and you just have to read the book. But yeah, anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I've been sitting here thinking about movement and listening to Laura and wanting to stop and hug her, and thinking about my niece in New York. I've got a niece who's trans. She's 12, and it's a very scary world, right now, that's for sure. So I was thinking back about movement. I was thinking of something that Namsham told me. I'm not Cheyenne by birth. I was adopted like 30 years ago by the person who was then the oldest living Sundance priest, and we had like a really close relationship. And Namsham taught me that like when people were lost in the past, you always go right. And if you think about it, if you keep getting lost and you keep turning right, where are you going to end up? Back where you started, right? Back where you started. And so movement, whether we think about time or space, so often in Indian country is a circle, right? Because you're going home. And that's something else I learned from Leroy Little Bear. Took me in his office as soon as I got there, and he said, Indians, always going home. So what's going to make you leave Alberta? And I looked at him and said, a job at the University of Oklahoma. So 4 years later, I walked into his office and said, got that job at the University of Oklahoma. Because people are always going home. And there's a line in The Marrow Thieves where Frenchie's mom says to Frenchie's dad, they're young, and he's gone to the city, and he has sort of fallen into imbalanced behavior, which I think so often in this work, but also in a lot of other Native work, comes forth as monstrosity, right? When we are no longer ourselves, we are not recognizably ourselves. The reason why Joan and Victor can't kill the villain in Empire of Wilds, because they're not murderers, right? But that's different than Frenchie needed to kill on occasion, right? And the Marrow Thieves and Hunting by Stars. So I think about all of that and think about what they're running from, because she said you gotta run to something, not from something, right? And they're definitely running from stuff. They're running from trauma. They're running from their own trauma. They're running from intergenerational trauma. And trauma is a fracture. It's not just the body, but it's a fracture in the spirit, and that has to be healed. And we do have traditional ways of dealing with that, right? But these kids aren't in a world where they necessarily have access to an elder who has puha, who knows, I mean, everybody has puha, but like knows how to manipulate puha, knows how to work with medicine, knows the ceremonies, right? To do this, to bring the soul back. In Hispanic cultures, the way indigenous people in Hispanic cultures in this continent here, and especially in Mexico, that idea of susto, that your soul has jumped out of your body and it has to be put back in. That's a concept that's a Cheyenne concept too. When you're fearful, Cheyennes believe you have 4 souls. One of them might jump out of your body. You got to keep at least one in there at all times or you got problems, right? So I think about what they're running from. But then when I think about what they're running to, they're going where we're always going. We're always going home. We're always going home. They don't know what home is in this world that they're in, and we may have a hard time with that too, right? Because home is so much more than a place. Home is family. Home is belonging, something that these kids want, something that we all desperately need as humans, right? We need to belong. We need to feel safe, and that's what home represents. So for me, no matter where that home is, and that home may move around like a teepee. Let's say you're from a culture that moves around. Home goes with you, right? Home goes with you. So home is something that can be moved. And I think that's where they're going. They just got to find it.
One more follow-up question, and then it'd be nice to, if Cherie would be willing to come up after this question and some responses from Laura and Kim. You know, thinking about we've been talking about also about who's reading these books. You know, we're seeing these books being embraced and loved and honored as they should be. You know, with the Neustadt Literary Prize this week here at OU, but also at the same time seeing others who are so freaked out by these books to the extent that they're banning these books and trying to deny, especially Native youth, from reading these stories, as well as non-Native youth who are also part of this history. As someone who's mixed, as so many of us are, it's, you know, thinking about, you know, how to honor, you know, and reckon with and coexist with all sides and all facets of oneself. And this is no different from history and what happens when history is being denied. But I want to think more proactively here and thinking about, you know, Marrow Thieves, for example, as Cherie has said before, is first and foremost, it was written for today's Native youth. It's something that really resonates with me, with my work, is first and foremost for Comanche youth and then other Native youth, and then whoever else who may want to engage in the conversations. But she says first and foremost for today's Native youth, and to give them, quote, hope that they are, quote, the absolute answer, unquote. She, for example, rewrote Marrow Thieves 11 complete times until the, quote, abject horror of residential schools and the hope and beauty of a people who could survive that abject horror of residential schools, until both of those things were truly present in the book. The responsibility of these stories, the dedication and commitment to these stories, to try to not just to a story's done and now I put it out there, but rather a story that can now try to really live up to that instructive work of the youth, Native youth especially, being that, quote, absolute answer. And so a question, just any thoughts y'all may have on why these books are so necessary, not just optional reading, but they are so necessary today's youth for this world that we're all trying to navigate through as best we can together?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I think it tells these stories that need to be kind of recognized, and it is a form of like witnessing someone telling honest truths and normalizing telling these stories, and not as a form of wanting pity, but as a form of normalizing it to let it go. Not as a means of spectacle either, but as a way to normalize our stories and to let some of these things go. So I guess something that I kind of said yesterday was about how when like Indigenous young people and old people, I guess, move through some of these spaces like academia, and we're hyper visible, but then we're also kind of refused. This thing of not the right body for that space. When they see themselves, their lives, and they can see their lives, their relatives written down in a book, and it's like a required reading versus like you're having to read The Great Gatsby or whatever. Yeah, like what does that instill in people? I think for me, I kind of hated American literature when I was in high school. And it was when I went on to Haskell when I got to read people like Simon Ortiz and Joy Harjo. And I think we had a little anthology called The Man to Send Rain Clouds. And that was the first time I had ever seen anybody talk about the spirit world. And I was like, wow, because any other time, well, my dad always had said, don't talk about things like that in front of Stahedkis because they'll make fun of you. They'll make fun of our ways. So I think part of it is normalizing this telling of our ways and having allies reading these stories and having allies speak up about them as well. But I think for the most part is just really having stories that our Indigenous youth can connect with and see themselves in and use it as a launching pad to sort through their education and just start sorting through the world instead of trying to sort it through like The Great Gatsby. Like really, I mean, it's hard. So, I mean, I think that's the most important place that I see it. The other is just around grappling with like anxiety, right? Because I think you see that in the characters, the students recognize it. And then from this in here, I mentioned it yesterday, but it's this line of like, who do you stand for? And Cherie talks about writing and her mentor, Lee Miracle, saying, who do you stand for? I can hear your grandmother in your writing. And I think even that is a reminder not only to our young people, but to ourselves of like, we're here, we have to have a lot of courage in these moments. What is the thing that will give us courage no matter what? Who and what do we stand for? I feel like that has been the absolute like ultimate gift of just reading that little line with all of the books of hers we read, all the dialogue we had, but like, who do you stand for? That's like the thing that I'm carrying now, so. Thank you, Cherie.
I don't know if this is obvious or not, so I'll say it. Like Dustin, I'm mixed. I have ancestry from every continent on this planet that has humans except Australia. So it's the benefits of doing your DNA. The facts are is that we all need to heal. Native and non-native people alike need to heal from settler colonialism. This impacted everybody. It impacts everyone who lives in the Americas today. It impacts people in a lot of places around the world. And I think that not only do we all need to heal, part of that process is that Native people need to be able to see themselves represented accurately and respectfully. When I was a small child, I was born in '68. Y'all, Sonny and Cher, that was about as good as it got because my auntie was convinced Cher was Native, so we had to watch her every week. It was a thing. It was a thing. There just wasn't much there. I call that era desperation for representation because we were desperate. We were still desperate in 1998 when I bought my daughter a Pocahontas CNC because it was better than The Farmer Says. It was something, right? It was something. It was some kind of representation. But non-Native people need to see Native people and themselves too. We have had a lot of discourse about colonialism in this country, but we haven't dealt with a lot of truth. We've dealt with a lot of political mythology. Every group of humans on the planet has a political mythology about who they are, right? This is me talking about Canada and the States real quick. In the United States, it's that we are morally right. We are morally right. In Canada, it's that they're kind. None of these things are truths, right? But they are the myths that we carry with ourselves. So, I do think that dystopian fiction in general is important. I'm going to go out on a huge limb next semester. I'm going to teach 2 Octavia Butler novels in one 2,000 level class. I know, edgy, just edgy. But not all dystopian fiction has hope. Cherie's fiction has hope. It has hope for healing. And I think those 2 things are crucial. We need to see dystopia right now, or else you might think you're insane, right? You need to see that we are not the only humans who have ever or could ever go through difficulties, right? Having things in the world being in upheaval. The pandemic was like a little bit of a taste of that, but things seem to be spinning further and further that way. And as Laura said, this does not need to be for the purpose of just seeing something and consuming it, right? This fiction is not created for consumption by people. This is not settler colonial poverty porn, right? These are serious stories. And I think it's important because it's not because anyone needs to feel guilty. And I tell my students this all the time. No one who is alive today is responsible for anything that took place 500 years ago. So what do we do with this knowledge, right? I don't want young Native people to catch themselves up in a victim narrative because that doesn't help us. We are victors, not victims. We've got to always be victors, not victims. Always, right? I also don't want non-Native young people to feel guilty because that is not the purpose of learning the truth about history and our reality today. What we should do, we all have privilege. We all do. Now, how do I explain privilege to my mama? How to have this conversation with my mama? I call my mom and say, Mom, are you blessed? And my mom says, yes. She can think of all kinds of ways in which she has things stacked against her in this world. I can add a few factors in and say, would it be worse if this? And she goes, oh, yes. What about this? She goes, yes. So my mom understands privilege. And I feel like if my mother can understand privilege, we can all understand privilege. What we're supposed to do is use that privilege to help other people, whatever privilege you've got. I've got one child out of my children I've had 4, I have lost one. I have one child that's exceedingly pretty. And when she was a young teenager, I made her deal with the fact that even though she is way darker than I am, right? She has other things about her that people pick at. Like, you got pretty privilege big time, and you need to acknowledge that and deal with it because it's real, right? We all have ways in which we're privileged. Whatever way in which you're privileged, we got to use that to help other people. That's the goal of being here. And I think another reason, I'm going to wrap it up, I promise, Dustin, we are not post-truth. We are not post-truth. What do I mean by an example of that? There was a certain individual whom I will not name because naming this individual causes problems, who claimed that there were not the residential school deaths, the boarding school deaths that we are telling you took place. If you believe that individual who is no longer with us right now on that, I want you to drive to where Laura went to college because you can drive to Lawrence, Kansas. It's not that hard to do. You can afford it. You can not eat a pizza once. You can skip some beer, okay? You can afford to drive to Lawrence, Kansas. Drive to Lawrence, Kansas. Go to Haskell Indian Nations University that used to be a boarding school. Go to the back and go to the cemetery and you look at those graves. You look at the baby graves. You look at that. You look at the kids who were 2 years old who were forced on a train in handcuffs. and taken away from their parents. You look at that. You go in the museum. You look at the menu, and you see that those kids had biscuits and gravy, biscuits and gravy, biscuits and gravy, biscuits and gravy every day, all day till Sunday when they got prunes. And then you deal with the fact that these kids died. We are not in a post-truth world. Why do we need to know truth? Not for anyone to feel bad, but for us to do some good. You cannot build a house on sand. I got that from some other place. You got to build a house on a solid rock. And if we build a culture, a country, a society on lies, then we are building it on sand. And we need some rock. We need something that's solid, something we can stand on, right? Before who we stand for, we got to have something we can stand on. So I think these books are important. I think they're important to teach. I think my former place of residence in Alberta is foolish for banning the marrow thieves. How crazy. If anyone needs that book, the young people in Alberta need that book. We need that book. So, okay, I'm against book banning, y'all. You can make decisions yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. On that note, this is my bad dad joke of the day, I guess. So there's the who and what to stand for, and right? And so, Cherie, would you mind joining us in standing a?
Can I want to say thank you.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I'm not going to talk for long because I want us to have a conversation, but I do want to say that for a lot of Indigenous people, especially the area I come from, so I'm Métis. My grandfather's family comes from the Red River. You may have heard, the Red River, Louis Riel, the resistance. That's where my père's family's from, and my grandmother's family are descended from the Penetanguishene half-breeds, which is how they identified themselves when they signed the first petition that came from a half-breed community, declaring us as like a separate nation in relationship with our Indigenous family. But we live on Anishinaabe land, and my great-grandmothers are Anishinaabe. That's Ojibwe. And one of our core teachings, the seven grandfathers, is humility. So if you want to throw an Indigenous person, except as far as I know, except for the people from the West Coast, because they have a different teaching where you have to stand tall and loud because you're representing everyone that came before you and everyone that will come forward. But for us, if you want to throw us for a loop, ask us to write a resume where you have to say some good stuff about yourself. So I need you to imagine sitting in this room with my heroes up here talking about my work. I have to tell you that that could have been a nightmare. I mean, we don't even really make eye contact because you don't want to take any space or time from anyone else. But I have to tell you that was so generous and so full of love. And I first of all, talking about Lee Miracle, my auntie, my mentor, great teacher, hearing you, specifically you, talk about her brought her right back. And she would love that for herself. She's from the West Coast. Her grandfather was Chief Dan George. She's from the Stalo people, and so she loved it. She's here right now, and she's having a good time. And I'm always really, really nervous. We all know I'm anxious. I wrote a book about it, but I'm always really extra nervous about taking care. I'm always really, really worried because I love us. And so I'm always really worried that, am I going to go too far in one direction? Am I going to step outside of what I'm supposed to do? I was trained by traditional storytellers, so I understand that there's a lot of responsibility around story because stories are powerful. And so I always really worry about taking care of as many of us as I can while also doing that work of, trying to tell the truth. And so hearing you all talk about how you felt care and saw yourselves I feel renewed. I feel like something's changed, you know, when it feels like your ribs have shifted. That's what my grandma used to say. Like, that's when you know something, that was a gooder, you know, that was a gooder. Like something has shifted, there's more room. I can take a deeper breath. So thank you for allowing me to breathe in this territory, on your land, and with your love. I love to hear Kim talking about, you know, the repetition of stories. Two things, and some of my new friends heard this last night at dinner, but the first thing is as I understood it, my grandmother and her sister, my great auntie Flora, they used to play euchre like it was an Olympic sport. And by the time I was 5, I had to know how to play euchre, because they also didn't go easy on you. You know, they'd be like, oh, go ahead, bring your candy to the table there. Let's see. Let's play some cards. And so you knew your candy was up. Like, that's it. They would take it, too, and they would eat it in front of you. Like, this is good. I put my teeth in for this one. This is good candy. And you're like, oh, my God. You're eating a friggin' piece of bologna. Great, thanks. But, you know, so they didn't take it easy on us. But the point of while we came to the table to play cards is they would tell stories while they were playing cards. And in my community, the language that they spoke is a kind of, it's like a kind of Michif, so it's really old Anishinaabe-Moan, old Ojibwe, and even older French. Every now and there's a Cree word thrown in, or they couldn't figure it out, just the plain old English word, but it's a very specific language. But you know, no one really spoke it anymore. That generation was the last generation. And so they used to tell me the stories in our language, and they would tell them to me in English, and they wanted me to repeat them back in English. And they would say, tell me that story, different but the same. And so two things. One, and it's, you know, sad, but they thought for the stories to live on that they should be in English, because that was a language that they saw wasn't going anywhere. And also, as much as I really, truly believe that we need our languages, you know, they were of the mind that this language might pass, but the way that we understand and the way that we think is always going to be in that story language. And the other thing is they wanted me to tell it different but the same, to make it my own, right? So, we talk about tradition a lot, and tradition is different from history. Tradition is the things that we understand that are important, that need to move forward. And so a lot of the job of a storyteller is to take the truths and the teachings that have come to us from the generations before, and our experiences, the maps of who we are, and to put it into a new vessel so that it can move and be delivered to the next generation, so they can accept it, so they can make it a part of their lives. It's important work of moving tradition. And they used to tell the stories at least 3 times, and I came to understand it like this. You know, when you have like a pad of paper and a pen, if you draw a circle, okay, you've drawn that circle, it's on that, you can see it. But if you take that pen and you put some weight on it, and you go over and over that circle, when you turn the page, you can feel the indentation of that circle on the next page. It's still there. And so by retelling our stories, it's the way that we make sure that they pass through time and generations, because they're important and we always have to feel them. And when Kim was talking about, you know, the science of shaping brains, this is the story my friends heard last night. Lee Miracle, from the time that she was 3, was taken to, they had opened an old age home near her community, and you know, her grandpa was very upset about it because he said people are dying twice, once when they leave home and then when they actually pass. So he would bring her, and when somebody was passing on, they would use their last breaths to push all of their story into her. And she would show up every day for years and years and years to collect story. And he said a part of the work, the important part, is not that she had to remember every single word yet. It was that she had to form her brain into the shape of a storyteller's brain. So he was having people tell her these stories so that she would, in her brain, that she would have rooms where stories could live. that her thoughts would hold, that her synapses, that the energy would move in a way that held these steady places where stories could live. And that was how he saw these old people continuing on through her. And so it was about shaping the way a storyteller's brain exists. And I absolutely, thinking about Laura's unactivated possibilities, the unactivated potentials of our ancestors, moves me in a way that I don't think anything else could. The understanding, the freedom to imagine an uncolonized existence. We understand that this is where we are now. This is the time. And to be honest, so many of our communities, we migrate, we intermarry, we adopt and adapt customs. We are a generous people. It's why we so successfully survived for thousands of years and have survived an apocalypse, right? It's that generosity. But it's also so valuable to imagine for ourselves an uncolonized existence. What might that look like? Because the important part of dreaming is that when we wake up and move with those dreams, that's planning. And that's how we get to the future, right? I think that is so beautiful in a way, and it's such a joy, right? I think we all deserve that, all of us, to think about. Yeah. And I want to just close. I know I talked about this yesterday. I come from a hunting tradition. Everyone in my family, they're all hunters. I was telling someone today, my youngest daughter, she's 19, she's in mortuary sciences at university right now because she's like a super goth. Like went all the way to the funeral home, you know what I mean? But she's, she's still like a hunter because she's from our family, and so she'll be there in her like black lipstick and, like a lacy top and like on her ATV with like a deer over the back, and I'm like, God, I'm so proud of you. I did something right. But we give gifts, and I feel very, I had to, like I said, I had to pass that border, and I couldn't pack everything, but for some reason, look, I did this horrible thing that my aunties would be, like, I'm going to hear about it. I packed all my beadwork. I have really nice beadwork. And I like to wear it, especially when I go to communities with other Nietzsches, because our beadwork says who we are. Métis beadwork is, we're the flower beadwork people. So there's stories behind all of our patterns, and I have some of my family's beadwork, and I packed it all up, and I left it at home. And yeah, I was so bummed. I can't even look fancy. Look how fancy. Look at this. Look at Kim with that tie. That's a smart dressed gentleman right there. Look at Laura with her, look, she's casually got this like blinging ring all done up. Damn. Anyways, but what I did manage to bring was I brought my silver jewelry. And I was like, man, I made a choice. I wonder why. Like it was so, and it was like right, not even packed away. It was like in my carry-on, like guarding it with my life. And I thought about that just because I'm like, as if I forgot my beadwork. But then I was sitting there and, Kim was talking and I thought, God, look at the heart on that human. Look how massive, like the amount of love that's being held. And you know how you know there's so much love in Kim is because she's so fierce. That's how you know someone is full of love, right? They have so much to give you, like you're gonna take it. And I mean, to be clear, I'll take it all. I'll take it all. But one of I have this silver bracelet, and it ends in 2 hearts. And I didn't notice it when I got it. And then I kept noticing it, and I thought, God, this is so nice. I've never seen anything like it, but it doesn't feel like it's mine. And I know that's now because it's yours, Kim. So I wanted to give this to you. Here, we're gonna exchange things, though. I'll give you my jade. Hey, Gretch, thank you. Thank you. So much. Thank you. Treasure this. And then I was looking in my jewelry box, and hey, I'm not making it up. I'm not that talented of a storyteller. I was looking in my jewelry box, and I saw this other bracelet, and I thought, God, I haven't seen this bracelet in so long. And I remember it was given to me by my good friend, Stuart Snake, who was a roadman from Winnebago. And it's actually his boy, Michael, who's on the cover of The Marrow Thieves. I have to tell you guys this quick story. So Michael Snake was dating one of my daughters. And I said, who's this boy? She saw a picture of him online. You know, he lived in Nebraska. He was skateboarding. He had really long hair. And there's a picture of him jumping. And his braid is like, you know, flying in the air. And my daughter comes up and she says, look at this picture of this boy. And I said, oh, who's that? She said, I don't know, but look at his hair. It's like the creator's just dropping him down to earth for me. 2 months later, that boy showed up at my house in Canada. Yeah. Well, we loved him. We kept him for a while. We went to film school. But one day I said, Michael, I got to go to do this event for the Marrow Thieves. Can you drive me? And he said, yeah, of course, sure. He's from Winnebago. They raise their kids real polite. And so I said, well, you might as well come in because I'm not going to be long, you know? So he says, okay, sure. So he comes in, he's, you know, carrying my stuff for me. He's a good boy. And I said, you know, just grab a seat. But what I did was I brought him to a Catholic all-girls school. And then, so he came into the room where they're all studying the Marrow Thieves. And so I started to talk and somebody goes, oh my God, it's Frenchie. And the whole auditorium's, and I was like, okay, Michael, you need to go back to the car because you're causing a scene. Or you need to stand right beside me so they pay attention to me. Anyways, his dad was a good friend of mine. I love Stuart Snake. He had beautiful, beautiful songs. And he told me beautiful stories. And there was something so kind and gentle about him. And Dustin, when you were talking, you made me think about my good friend, and I appreciate that. And so this bracelet is for you. It'll bend open there. You're real masculine, yeah. Last night, you know, I had dinner with some of the most beautiful people I've ever met. This was Laura and her class. And the way that I saw those students, I said to Laura, man, you are exactly who I've always wanted to be. You know, she didn't raise her voice once. And everyone was talking. We had a good time. She'd just start talking. And the whole room would say, oh my God, I wish you were around when my kids were young. But she has this gift, this way of pulling together a circle. And we talked about my book, Venko. And so I wrote this book, this witchy book, and I thought, the one thing I want for these witches, these powerful women, these diverse, these brilliant women, is I want them to have something that is really mundane, but that they think of it as, you know, that it's really magical, because I love ceremony in the everyday. I love magic in the mundane. And so I thought I want to give them something kind of like, you know, that seems commonplace, that they covet, that's a part of their magic. And I was like, what's something that's sort of, that we don't really pay attention to? And I thought about souvenir culture, you know, like these little souvenir tchotchkes, I think, you know, they say. And my mare, my grandmother, used to have a silver spoon collection, you know, those little ones, you travel somewhere and you get a spoon. So Oklahoma, and it's like you put it, they have those really ugly holders you put on the wall, and they put them in there, you know? Yeah, so like, you know, my mare passed, and my mom was like, do you want the spoon collection? And I was like, please no. I'll take her Avon jewelry before I take the spoons. But I thought, that's perfect, because it's something that's everywhere, right? And we don't really think about it. And so I thought, somehow I'm gonna work spoons into this story. And then I thought, well, I don't know anything. Like a normal person, I don't know anything about the history of souvenir spoons. So I went on the computer and I'm like, hey, souvenir spoons, North America. And it turns out, as I'm writing this witch story, that the very first souvenir spoon ever what made for commercial purposes, came out in 1892 out of Salem, Massachusetts, and it was commemorating the 200-year anniversary of the Salem witch trials. So I thought, okay, universe, I get it. It's a witch story, I get it. So I looked them up, and it was by a company called Daniel Lowe and Son Company, and their jewelry store was based out of an old meeting house in Salem where they used to they had the trials for the witches. And I thought, well, frig, that's it. Almost said the real F word there, sorry. I said, that's it, that's what is happening. So I looked to see if they were still around, and there was a couple of antique sites, and I found some. There's still a few in existence. So I got one, and I had a jeweler make it into a ring for me, one of the original witch spoons that are in the Book of Encode that exist in the world from 1892, and that's for you, Laura. It doesn't fit, it bends.
Well, I want you to have my Muskogee stars.
Why? Make wish. Thank you. Look at this. Thank you so much. I want to turn it over to everyone else, and I'm going to sit down because I want to look at these pretty people some more. Thank you.
I think we have time for like one quick question.
Oh shit! Did I talk for that long?
No, it's a short panel. Hey, no, you're great. They came to hear you. Hey. Is there any closing comment or question, food for thoughts, someone feels compelled right now? No pressure. There's a hand back there.
Hello, my name's Luis. Hello. And I would like to ask about the last speaker. You were talking about language, and as well language coming up again. And I would like to also ask the whole panel as well about time, right? How does time play a role in just how we think about language, or how we need to change our sense of how time functions to be able to have differing understandings or much more open understandings as well. I don't know. That's sort of what I was thinking about.
I got a quick answer. Go to the South Oval. Go to the first building on the right on the South Oval. There's a window at the basement level. You can sit there and you can watch Foucault's pendulum. It's not Foucault as in Structures of Power Foucault, but the other Foucault. And you can watch the world move. You can watch it, the world move right there. And then you will realize there is no such thing as time. That is a human construct. There's just movement through space. It's a great way to spend a few minutes with your class, too, by the way.
Cherie, is there anything you'd like to?
Oh, I will just say, in my community's language, we don't really differentiate, there's no tenses for past and present and future, and there's also no pronouns. There's no people. My grandmother would say oh, your auntie. Oh, he's a beautiful man. They would all be mixed. There's the genders. So I think that plays a lot of. It was hard going to school after and sort of being in that structured environment. But I think that fluidity in language leaves so much room for story. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
English doesn't borrow from other languages. It follows them down dark alleys and rolls them for loose grammar.
And also, and I recognize we're at time and folks may have to step to other appointments and commitments and responsibilities, but I'm also reminded in all this emphasis on stories and the ways in which the words, the languages that we choose, the ones that we're working with, the ones that we're learning and relearning, reminded of my late auntie who said that when different people tell the same story, when people come together, when the stories come together, there is something really transformative. And she says that's when the magic happens. And literally, magic in a textbook definition can mean about making the impossible possible. And even as impossible as sometimes the stories that we are going through and the experiences we're going through, there is still back to this idea of hope, and this hope that comes across in Cherie's work and my colleagues' work here, and just thinking about the ways in which the magic continues to happen. And so with that said, just again, one more please round of applause for my colleagues, for Cherie. And and if there's additional follow-up questions, folks might be able to stick around for just a little bit. But safe travels, good thoughts to you all. And thank you all for being here. Harjo.